Okay, in the last two chapters of this course, we're going to talk about inventories. And the two types of inventories from a conceptual point of view relate back to the demand concept that we mentioned in the forecasting chapter. You can have independent demand or dependent demand. And depending on the type of demand, that's going to drive how you plan for your inventories. Inventory is defined as a stock of materials used to facilitate production or to satisfy your customer's demand. There are different types of inventories. The traditional manufacturing categories are raw materials and purchase parts. Second category is work in process, which really refers to when you pull those materials out of the bin or stock and put them into on the shop floor so you can start working on them and assembling them. You're adding value when you do that. And the third type of inventory is when you finish all the work on the shop floor and before you're ready to ship it to the customer, you move it into an area called the finished goods. There's a fourth category which is also going into, it's not called inventory, but it's every bit a part of inventory, and it's called maintenance, repair, and supplies. These are items which are expensed. They're not included in your inventory in a dollar sense, but they are important in any operation to get the job done. Different types of technologies that are involved in inventories. Barcoding is one of the most common ones that are used to help move things along and identify them rather than count things manually or with paper documents. And then there's several other things depending on the type of operation you have. Figure 15.1 gives you an example of a flow chart of the concepts that we just talked about. You can move product from your raw material into the shop floor, and there could be several stations going on in work in process at the same time. But once you've completely produced the product, it gets moved into a finished goods and ready to go to a customer. Keep in mind that we're talking about different types of operations and flows. What you're dealing with in liquid sense may be a lot different than what you deal with in a part sense, and in a service sense you have an even different type of operation there. Purpose of inventories is to protect against uncertainties, and we do that by building what we call safety stock. How do you determine how much safety stock you need? Well, you look at the demand, the supply, the lead times, and the schedule, and try to get a balance of that. We will get into more detail in this chapter on that. You try to cover anticipated changes, especially in your finished goods and raw material categories. And when you're talking about pipeline type of inventories, you have to take into consideration the transfer issue that goes into all three categories. There are costs involved with all inventories. Usually they're measured in what we call SKU, or basically these are units of production. As well as the item costs, you have setup costs, which is the cost of setting the process up, as we mentioned, downtime and idle time. And those costs are usually allocated to the particular order or the unit as well. Carrying costs are a third type of cost. They are considered holding costs, and that's involved with the cost of the building, the utilities, insurance, handling, all the costs that are involved with actually operating that have to be allocated back to the unit of production. let's see, in an inventory cost structure, 35% is a normal figure for carrying costs, which means that if your inventory is worth $1, you probably have to add another 35 cents for the things that are not what we call direct costs related. Obsolescence, storage, material handling, tax and insurance are all part of that. Shrinkage is a cost in itself because when you produce something, you count it, you put it into inventory and you say it's there. But unfortunately, for a lot of different reasons, when you come and count your inventory, when it's time to take it out of there, it may not be there. And that's written off as a cost as well. The last thing is out of stock out costs, which means you've lost some money because you haven't had the product or the service there when you need it for the customer, and you're paying a penalty to go back and now recreate it. Okay, we talked about dependent and independent demand. This chapter focuses on independent demand, and it really looks at the market demand and what's being forecasted. And it's the philosophy here is you replenish inventory based on your forecasts when you reach a certain specified level so that you don't run out. Dependent demand, on the other hand, are parts that go into finished products and are dependent on that. That's a duplication of definition, but you basically, they're driven by the products that are going into inventory instead of a forecast, and you need to, it's mostly a support type of thinking and operation. Economic order quantity is something that's very much recognized and used by almost all inventory categories. We'll talk about it in this chapter a lot. The real objective is to find an order quantity that both minimizes cost and gets you the product there when you need it, not any sooner, not any later. There are many assumptions that go into an EOQ. You look at the demand and try to define that. You have to look at lead time and get your arms around the lead time. You basically assume there are no stockouts in your thinking, and you have to order the material in quantities that optimize both your costs and your schedule. And you look at when costs are fixed costs and when they're variable costs to determine the cost of your individual production unit. There's a trade-off between frequency of ordering and inventory levels. Sometimes you say, well, maybe we're better off keeping our inventory down and ordering more often. Or sometimes you take the EOQ route and say, well, let's optimize the cost of an order and balance that against the cost of carrying it in inventory. As we said earlier, there are different elements that get considered into the calculation, such as demand, costs, unit costs, the cost of carrying your inventory, lot sizing, and several other factors. We will talk in this chapter about the calculations in specific problems that we'll work with, and we'll consider some other formulas to determine trade-offs between one type of decision and another. Relevant supply chain costs are important when you get into personal computer inventories, because you may stock some computers either as a finished good or as a semi-finished item, but then you usually have other costs that go with that that you have to consider, especially with the change in computer life. To be so frequently, a computer that sits on a shelf too long may become obsolete, and that's a big cost when you have to write that off. There are different types of systems for looking at your inventory and making sure they're updated. We'll talk about these systems in a chapter. And we'll look at the different elements in them in terms of calculating them. Thing to note in this chapter is that we're always trying to keep in mind the service aspect of something, as well as when we're dealing with a service instead of a product. Reorder points are important to take into consideration, but from a service point of view, you make certain assumptions. One is probability all orders will be refilled while waiting time takes place. And you have to look at other factors such as percentage of demand that's filled from stock and percentage of time the system has stock on hand. Those are all have to be considered when making decisions. Reorder point is just basically simply that point when you have to replenish an order for either parts or any other level of stock. Like all the other things we talk about, there are calculations which we'll get into in studying this chapter. Periodic reviews are different than fixed interval reviews, because in both cases you have to look at your inventory on a frequency basis and check it and make sure that it's in balance with what your philosophy in carrying inventory is. Periodic review system usually has a target inventory level rather than a reorder point. It basically says you always want to maintain so much inventory. It does not use EOQ directly, and the order interval is usually fixed, but the quantity will vary. One last concept of inventory before we leave this chapter is the ABC inventory management. What it basically does is tells the person using it to break their inventory up into 3 priorities: A priority, B priority, C priority. Usually that's determined based on usage. So your A items are the ones that are sold the most and used the most, so you manage them in a different manner. Your B items are lower volume level. Your C items you might not manage the same way, and you might just say we'll do that on a special order basis because the frequency isn't enough to try to manage it the same way you do your A items. You'll get a chance to look at some of the statistics and quantifications of these 3 categories. And what you want to do is be careful not to get twisted around in your thinking, especially when you're dealing with dollars. Sometimes you look at the dollar level of an inventory category, such as your A's or even your B's, and that may not always give the importance of the particular unit. I'll give you one example. In many electronic manufacturing organizations, the power unit is one of the key elements in an assembly. You only need one. Dollar-wise, it may not be really significant, although most often it is. But the real danger here is a power unit could have a lead time. I've seen it in some cases where its lead time is up to 10 months. And without the power unit, you literally are held up from continuing the rest of your manufacturing ability. So even though your usage is not great, it may be very important to never run out of a power unit in order to keep your assembly line going.